bamboo beneath the hills. Shandong Province, spring 1972. Archaeologist Lin Wei had spent 6 years excavating minor Han Dynasty tombs on the outskirts of Linyi, before the crew clearing a construction site at Yingshan, Silver Sparrow Mountain, a low, unremarkable hill that had never appeared in any list of significant historical locations. Uncovered, quite by accident, a pair of tombs that would occupy the remainder of her career, and in ways she could not have anticipated on that first cold morning. Rewrite a portion of Chinese military history that scholars had considered settled for the better part of 2,000 years. Construction workers found it, her senior colleague Professor Han told her, as their small team drove out to the site in a truck rattling over roads still rough with late winter mud, digging foundations for a new building. Apparently, when they struck what they assumed at first was simply an unusually large deposit of waterlogged wood. It was only when one of them noticed the wood was inscribed with characters that anyone thought to stop digging and send word to the provincial bureau. What they found over the following weeks of painstaking excavation was a burial dating to the early Han Dynasty, its wooden coffin chamber having been sealed by a fortunate combination of soil composition and groundwater conditions, in an environment airless and waterlogged enough to have preserved, for well over 2,000 years, several thousand individual strips of bamboo, each inscribed in ink with characters that had, in the ordinary course of history, no reasonable expectation of surviving even a fraction of that span, bamboo being, under almost any other conditions, among the most perishable of ancient writing materials, prone to rot, insect damage, and simple decay within decades rather than millennia. We will need to raise them with extraordinary care, Professor Han said, examining the first tangled mass of strips with an expression Lin Wei would remember for the rest of her own career, a mixture of scholarly excitement so profound it bordered on something closer to reverence. The moment this material is exposed to air, it will begin to dry and crack within hours. We have, I would estimate, a matter of days to record, photograph, and stabilize whatever text these strips contain before the physical evidence itself begins to disintegrate around us. It was in the frantic, meticulous work of those following days, strips lifted individually from the wet clay, photographed under careful lighting before they could warp, laid out in provisional sequence on trays lined with damp cloth to slow the drying that would otherwise have destroyed them within hours, that Lin Wei first encountered, fragment by painstaking fragment, a text that would eventually be identified as something scholars had argued about, inconclusively, for the better part of 2 millennia. A treatise on warfare attributed to a strategist named Sun Bin, a figure whose very existence as a historical person separate from the much more famous Sun Tzu had been, until that spring, a matter of genuine and unresolved scholarly dispute. What the old records said and what they did not. The confusion, as Professor Han explained to Lin Wei over the following weeks, as the team worked to catalog and begin translating the recovered strips, had persisted for good and specific historical reasons. The great historian Sima Qian, writing more than a century after these events, tells us in his records of the grand historian that there were, in fact, 2 strategists named Sun in the ancient military tradition, Sun Wu, whom most scholars have simply called Sun Tzu, the presumed author of the famous treatise on war that has been studied and quoted for 2,500 years. and a later descendant of his, several generations removed, named Sun Bin, who lived roughly a century and a half after his more famous ancestor, and who was said, by Sima Qian's own account, to have written his own separate treatise on military strategy. But here is the difficulty scholars have wrestled with for the better part of 2,000 years. Sun Bin's treatise, if it ever truly existed as a separate and complete work, simply vanished from the historical record at some point in antiquity, lost, presumably, sometime during the great disruptions of the centuries that followed, whether through deliberate destruction, simple neglect, or the ordinary slow decay that has claimed the vast majority of ancient Chinese texts we know only by title and reputation. For nearly 2,000 years, no verified copy of Sun Bin's treatise survived anywhere, in any library, in any collection, in any form, and a great many scholars over those centuries came to doubt whether it had ever truly existed as an independent work at all, rather than simply being a later confusion, an alternate name mistakenly applied to the same famous ancestor's original treatise. The two suns gradually collapsed together in popular memory into a single, semi-legendary figure whose life story blended details that may, in fact, have belonged to two entirely separate men living a century and a half apart. What we appear to be holding in our hands in this tomb, Professor Han said, turning over a single fragile bamboo strip with the particular reverence of a scholar watching a 2,000-year-old academic argument being resolved directly in front of him, may well be the first verified physical evidence in 2 millennia that Sun Bin was in fact a genuinely separate historical figure, with a genuinely separate body of written strategic thought, entirely distinct from his more famous ancestors, a distinction that history itself very nearly allowed to be forgotten forever, and that has only survived at all because of the particular, entirely accidental combination of waterlogged clay and airless burial conditions in one unremarkable hillside tomb that no one in 2,000 years had any particular reason to disturb until a construction crew happened to break ground here this past winter. What Sima Qian recorded of the man himself. It was in the weeks that followed, as the excavation team worked to stabilize and begin translating the recovered strips, that Lin Wei found herself returning again and again to the older historical account, Sima Qian's brief but vivid biography of Sun Bin, written more than a century after the events it described, and treated for 2,000 years afterward as one of the more dramatic and memorable episodes in the entire ancient military tradition. Regardless of whether scholars believed the treatise attributed to him had ever truly existed as a separate work. According to Sima Qian's account, Sun Bin had studied military strategy as a young man alongside a fellow student named Pang Huan, both of them pupils. The tradition held of a reclusive and semi-legendary teacher of strategy and philosophy who lived apart from the political intrigues of the warring states of that era. The two young men were said to have been close companions during their years of study. Sun Bin, by every account, the more naturally gifted strategist of the two, though Pang Huan was ambitious, capable, and crucially, considerably less patient about waiting for recognition than his friend appeared to be. Pang Huan left their shared studies first, taking service as a general in the state of Wei, where his genuine talent won him rapid advancement and eventually command of Wei's formidable army, an army that, under his leadership, achieved real and significant victories against Wei's rival states in the years that followed. It was several years into this successful career, according to Sima Qian's account, that Pang Huan, learning that his old friend Sun Bin's reputation for strategic brilliance had begun to spread even without any major campaign yet to his name, invited Sun Bin to join him in Wei, ostensibly as a gesture of old friendship and a genuine offer to serve together. But in fact, the historical record makes clear. Driven by an ugly and increasingly consuming fear that Sun Bin's evident and widely acknowledged talent, once properly demonstrated on any real battlefield, would inevitably eclipse Pang Huan's own hard-won reputation and standing. Betrayal. What followed, according to Sima Qian's account and the broader tradition it established, was one of the more genuinely dark episodes preserved in the ancient Chinese historical record. Pang Huan, unable to bring himself to simply have his old friend killed outright, which would have exposed him to considerable political and personal disgrace, instead arranged to have Sun Bin falsely accused of a capital crime. Using forged evidence and manipulated testimony to convince the king of Wei that Sun Bin had been secretly conspiring with a rival state. The punishment handed down, and here the historical record is specific, and to modern readers encountering it for the first time, genuinely shocking in its cruelty, was a particular form of ancient Chinese corporal punishment known as bin, from which Sun Bin's own historical name is in fact partly derived, involving the deliberate removal of the kneecaps, a mutilation intended not merely to punish, but to permanently and visibly cripple its victim, ensuring he could never again walk unaided, let alone personally command troops in the field. Sima Qian's account adds that Sun Bin's face was additionally tattooed with markings identifying him as a convicted criminal, a further, deliberately public humiliation meant to ensure that wherever he went for the remainder of his life, any observer would immediately recognize him as a disgraced and punished man, unfit for any position of honor or command. Pang Huan's calculation, according to the tradition, was precise and cold. A Sun Bin crippled and marked as a criminal, unable to walk and permanently disgraced in the eyes of any court, pose no further threat to Pang Huan's own reputation and ambitions, while the surviving fragments of Sun Bin's evident strategic genius, knowledge Pang Huan himself still hoped, even after arranging his old friend's mutilation, to somehow extract and claim credit for might yet be salvaged, if Sun Bin could be kept alive, dependent, and psychologically broken enough to eventually be persuaded to share what he knew for Pang Huan's own benefit rather than any rivals. It very nearly worked exactly as Pang Huan intended. The long deception. Sun Bin, according to Sima Qian's account, understood almost immediately upon his mutilation and disgrace exactly what game his old friend was now attempting to play, recognizing that Pang Huan, having crippled him rather than killed him outright, must still believe some portion of Sun Bin's strategic knowledge could yet be extracted for his own use, and that his own survival, for as long as it continued, depended entirely on convincing Pang Huan that no such knowledge remained worth extracting at all. What followed was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most sustained and psychologically demanding acts of deception recorded anywhere in the ancient historical tradition. Sun Bin, confined and dependent, is said to have begun deliberately feigning madness, at first through small, carefully calculated eccentricities, and then over an extended period that the historical record suggests lasted months rather than weeks, escalating into behavior so convincingly deranged. Refusing food that he suspected might be poisoned by pretending to believe it was already spoiled or contaminated, laughing and weeping without apparent cause, scrawling nonsensical marks rather than any coherent strategic writing whenever pressed to demonstrate his knowledge, even, according to some versions of the tradition, deliberately soiling himself and living for a period among farm animals to further convince his guards, and eventually Pang Huan himself, that whatever brilliant strategic mind had once existed in this crippled, disgraced man had been entirely and permanently destroyed by his mutilation and humiliation. I want you to understand, Lin Wei's colleague Professor Han told her, discussing the historical tradition one evening as the team continued its painstaking work translating the recovered bamboo strips, that this deception, if the tradition is accurate even in its broad outline, required Sun Bin to sustain a performance of complete mental collapse for a period of months, under close and hostile observation, at a moment when his own body had just been permanently and violently crippled. In a foreign court where every single person watching him had every incentive to report the slightest inconsistency directly to the man who had ordered his mutilation in the first place. It is, in its own way, every bit as remarkable a demonstration of strategic patience and self-command as anything Sun Bin is credited with achieving on an actual battlefield in the years that followed. And it is, I think, rather too easily overlooked by readers who focus only on the more dramatic battles that came later, because the deception itself involved no armies, no maneuvering, nothing that looks on its surface like conventional warfare at all. And yet it was, in every meaningful sense, the first and in some ways the most demanding campaign of Sun Bin's entire strategic career, waged not against an enemy army, but against a single suspicious observer, using nothing but patience, self-control, and an intimate understanding of exactly what that observer wanted and expected to see. Oh, this is great. Sun Bin's deception eventually convinced Pang Huan's household to relax its close surveillance, and it was during this period of reduced vigilance that word of Sun Bin's plight reached an envoy from the rival state of Qi, who had traveled to Wei on unrelated diplomatic business, and who, hearing rumors of a crippled, apparently mad prisoner whose strategic reputation had once been considerable before his fall, arranged, through channels the historical record leaves frustratingly vague, to secretly meet with Sun Bin and assess for himself whether any genuine strategic mind still remained beneath the performance of madness that had, by this point, convinced nearly everyone else in Wei. What the Qi envoy found, according to the tradition, was a man whose body had been permanently and cruelly broken, but whose mind, far from having deteriorated, had spent his entire period of apparent madness quietly observing, analyzing, and refining his understanding of exactly the kind of strategic problems the deception itself had forced him to grapple with in miniature. How to convince a hostile, suspicious observer to see exactly what that observer expected and wanted to see, rather than the truth actually in front of him. The envoy arranged, at very considerable personal risk, to smuggle Sun Bin out of Wei entirely, concealed, according to the most commonly repeated version of the tradition, inside a covered cart carrying diplomatic goods back toward the Qi capital. A crippled man unable to walk on his own, hidden among ordinary cargo, passing through checkpoints and border crossings where any sufficiently careful search would have discovered him, and in all likelihood, ended both his life and the envoy's own diplomatic career on the spot. What Sun Bin brought to Qi? Sun Bin arrived in the state of Qi, a broken man in body, but, as he would very quickly demonstrate, entirely undiminished in the particular strategic gifts that had originally provoked Pang Huan's murderous jealousy in the first place. And it was here, in his new adopted home, that the historical record's most famous and best documented episode of his career took place, an episode that Sima Qian records in enough specific, verifiable detail that even scholars who doubted the existence of Sun Bin's own separate treatise had never seriously doubted that these particular events had genuinely occurred. His first recorded demonstration of strategic insight in Qi, according to the tradition, involved not warfare at all but a chariot race, a wager arranged among Qi's nobility, in which the general Tian Jai, who had taken the crippled and disgraced Sun Bin into his household as a guest and advisor, had repeatedly lost significant sums of money racing his own chariots against those of the king of Qi and other high nobles, because Tian Jai's horses, while genuinely excellent, were consistently and predictably outmatched, tier for tier, by the marginally superior horses maintained by his wealthier and more powerful rivals. You are racing your best horse against his best horse, your middle horse against his middle horse, and your weakest against his weakest. Sun Bin is recorded as observing, upon learning the structure of the wager, and losing all three races every time, because in every single tier, your rival's horses are marginally superior to your own. I would ask you to reconsider the order of your races entirely. Race your weakest horse first, against his strongest. You will lose that race decisively, but it costs you nothing you were not already losing. Then race your strongest horse against his middle horse, which your strongest horse can very likely beat, and your middle horse against his weakest, which your middle horse can also very likely beat. You will lose one race badly and win two comfortably, and the wager as a whole, structured this way, favors you rather than your rival, using precisely the same three horses you have always raced, arranged in an order your rival has no reason to expect, and every reason, having watched you lose in the conventional order for years, to assume you will continue using. The strategy worked exactly as predicted, winning Tian Jai a substantial sum, and more importantly for the crippled, penniless refugee who had proposed it, immediately and dramatically establishing Sun Bin's reputation at the Qi court as a strategist of genuine and immediately demonstrable insight, a reputation that, within a remarkably short period, brought him directly to the attention of the king of Qi himself, and set in motion the sequence of events that would, within a few short years, bring Sun Bin face to face once more with the old friend who had crippled and disgraced him. Besieged way to rescue Zhao. The opportunity came in the form of a genuine military crisis. The state of Wei, commanded in the field by none other than Pang Huan himself, launched a major campaign against the neighboring state of Zhao, laying siege to Zhao's capital and threatening its complete conquest. Zhao appealed to Qi for military assistance, and the Qi court, after considerable internal debate, agreed to send an army to Zhao's aid, an army that Tian Jai was given command of, with Sun Bin, still unable to walk and traveling by covered chariot rather than on horseback or on foot, serving as his strategic advisor. Tian Jai's initial instinct, according to Sima Qian's account, was straightforward and conventional. March the Qi army directly to Zhao's besieged capital and engage Pang Huan's Wei forces there, in a direct relief of the siege. Sun Bin, from his covered chariot, proposed something considerably less obvious and considerably more consequential, a strategy that would become, over the following centuries, one of the most frequently cited and imitated stratagems in the entire tradition of Chinese military thought, eventually given its own formal name, besiege Wei to rescue Zhao, a phrase still used today, more than 2,000 years later. As a general description of any strategy that addresses a problem indirectly by striking at a vulnerability the enemy cannot afford to ignore, rather than confronting the problem directly where the enemy is strongest and best prepared. Pang Huan's army is currently besieging Zhao's capital, fully committed to that siege, far from Wei's own home territory. Rai Sun Bin argued, according to the tradition, if we march directly to Zhao and engage him there, we fight him on ground of his own choosing, against an army that is fresh, well supplied by its own siege lines, and fully prepared for exactly the relief force he must know Zhao will eventually send. Instead, I propose we march not toward Zhao at all, but directly toward Wei's own capital, which Pang Huan has left lightly defended in order to commit his full strength to the siege of Zhao. Pang Huan cannot allow his own capital to fall while he remains occupied elsewhere. He will be forced to abandon his siege of Zhao and march his army back to defend his home territory, and when he does, his men will be exhausted from a rapid, forced march back across considerable distance, arriving at a battlefield of our choosing rather than his own, against a Qi army that has had ample time to rest, prepare its position, and wait for exactly this moment. The strategy worked precisely as predicted. Pang Huan, learning that Wei's own capital was under direct threat, abandoned his siege of Zhao and marched his army back at forced speed to defend his homeland, arriving exhausted at Guiling, where Sun Bin's carefully prepared Qi forces inflicted a decisive defeat on Wei's army, a victory that saved Zhao from conquest, established Qi as a major military power in its own right, and for Sun Bin personally, represented the first direct strategic defeat he had ever inflicted on the old friend who had crippled him. Pang Huan himself survived the battle, escaping the field, and would not face his final reckoning with Sun Bin for another 12 years. The Maoling. The second and final confrontation between the two men came in 341 BC, when Wei, once again under Pang Huan's command, launched a fresh campaign against the state of Han, prompting Han to appeal to Qi for assistance in circumstances that closely echoed the earlier Zhao crisis. Sun Bin, once again serving as strategic advisor to a Qi relief force, proposed a variation on his earlier successful stratagem. But this time, rather than simply threatening Wei's home territory to draw Pang Huan's army into a hasty retreat, Sun Bin designed a deception intended to lure Pang Huan into a specific and carefully prepared trap. The stratagem, which survives in enough detail in the historical record to have become, alongside the besiege Wei to rescue Zhao maneuver, one of the most frequently cited episodes in the entire ancient Chinese military tradition, exploited a very specific piece of psychological and logistical knowledge, The fact that an invading army's cooking fires, counted nightly by any competent enemy scout observing from a distance, served as a reasonably reliable indicator of that army's actual strength. Since each fire typically represented cooking for a roughly consistent number of soldiers, Sun Bin ordered the Qi army, as it advanced into Wei territory, to build a deliberately excessive number of cooking fires on its first night's encampment, enough fires to suggest an army of some 100,000 men. On the second night, he ordered the number of fires reduced to suggest an army of perhaps 50,000. On the third night, reduced further still, to suggest a force of barely 20,000, a steadily shrinking count that, to any scout reporting faithfully back to Pang Huan, told a consistent and entirely plausible story, that the Qi army, having advanced into hostile territory, was suffering catastrophic desertion, its soldiers abandoning the campaign in ever greater numbers with each passing day, exactly the pattern a nervous, poorly motivated invading force might realistically be expected to show. Pang Huan will conclude from the pattern of these fires exactly what any experienced commander would conclude. Sun Bin explained to Tian Jai, according to the tradition, that the Qi army is disintegrating from within, its soldiers fleeing in growing numbers, its strength diminishing by half with each passing day. He will conclude further that an army in this condition represents an opportunity too valuable to pass up, a chance to destroy a collapsing enemy force with a small, fast-moving detachment of his own best troops, rather than waiting for his full army to catch up and engage what he believes is already a defeated and dwindling enemy. He will pursue us, and he will pursue us quickly, with a force considerably smaller than his full strength, because he will believe, based on everything his own scouts have faithfully reported to him, that a small, fast force is all that is needed to finish off an enemy already destroying itself through desertion. Sun Bin, having calculated with considerable precision exactly how quickly Pang Huan's pursuing force would need to travel to catch what he believed was a rapidly weakening enemy, selected a narrow, heavily wooded stretch of road at Maling, where the pursuing Wei column would necessarily be forced to travel in a long, exposed line, and prepared his own forces in concealed positions along both sides of that road, along with a substantial contingent of crossbowmen, instructed, according to one of the more evocative details preserved in the historical tradition, to hold their fire until they saw a torch lit beneath a particular large tree that Sun Bin had ordered stripped of its bark and inscribed with a message, the tree serving as both a signal marker for his own concealed troops and, in a detail that speaks to Sun Bin's characteristic attention to the psychological dimension of warfare, even in his moment of final triumph, a message intended for Pang Huan himself. Pang Huan, pursuing exactly as predicted, exactly as quickly as predicted, arrived at the narrow road at Maling after nightfall, and noticing the pale stripped bark of the large tree standing out clearly in the darkness, is recorded as having ordered a torch brought so that he could read the inscription carved into it, an act that provided the very signal Sun Bin's concealed crossbowmen had been waiting for. The inscription, according to Sima Qian's account, read simply, "Pang Huan dies beneath this tree." The volley of crossbow fire that followed, launched from concealed positions along both sides of the narrow road the instant the torch revealed Pang Huan's position, devastated the exposed Wei column, and Pang Huan himself, according to the tradition, recognizing in his final moments the full and complete extent of the strategic humiliation his old friend had engineered against him across 12 years of patient, careful preparation, is recorded as having taken his own life on the battlefield. Reportedly with the bitter acknowledgement that he had, through his own arrogance and underestimation of a man he had once tried to destroy entirely, made that wretch's reputation. What happened to the man afterward? Here the historical record, so vivid and detailed through the two great confrontations at Geiling and Malling, grows suddenly and frustratingly sparse. Sima Qian's account tells us that Sun Bin's reputation as a strategist of the first rank was, after Malling, permanently and unassailably established throughout the warring states of that era, and that a treatise on military strategy bearing his name was known to exist and to circulate, at least for some period, among students of warfare in the centuries that immediately followed. But of Sun Bin's own later life, his eventual death, or the specific circumstances under which his written treatise was eventually lost to history, the ancient record says essentially nothing at all, a silence that would persist, unbroken by any surviving physical copy of his actual writing, for well over 2,000 years. It is one of the genuine frustrations of studying this period, Professor Han told Lin Wei, as the excavation team continued its painstaking work translating the recovered bamboo strips through the following months, that we know an enormous amount about certain dramatic episodes in Sun Bin's career, his betrayal, his mutilation, his deception of Pang Huan, the two great battles that defined his military reputation, and almost nothing at all about what became of him afterward or how. Precisely, the written treatise Sima Qian tells us he composed came to vanish so thoroughly that for 2,000 years afterward, scholars could not even agree with confidence that it had ever existed as a genuinely separate work at all, distinct from his more famous ancestors' writing. We have, in a sense, inherited a magnificent and dramatic first half of a biography, and almost nothing of the second half at all, and it is precisely that missing second half, or at least a crucial fragment of it, that these bamboo strips we are now so carefully excavating may finally allow us to begin recovering, for the first time in 2,000 years. What the strips actually said. The full translation and analysis of the recovered bamboo strips took Lin Wei and her colleagues the better part of the following decade, a painstaking process complicated by the fragmentary and disordered state in which the strips had survived, many broken, some missing entirely, their original sequence disrupted by 2,000 years of settling earth and groundwater that had jumbled what had once been carefully bound bundles of text into a tangled mass that had to be reconstructed. Strip by individual strip, based on careful analysis of handwriting, content, and the physical characteristics of the bamboo itself. What eventually emerged, once enough of the fragmentary text had been reconstructed and cross-referenced against the surviving historical tradition, was confirmation of exactly what Professor Han had suspected from that very first frantic week of excavation. A genuinely separate military treatise, distinct in its specific content, vocabulary, and strategic emphasis from the more famous work attributed to Sun Bin's ancestor, discussing military principles and in several passages that specifically corresponded to details preserved in Sima Qian's historical account, direct references to the campaigns against Wei that had defined Sun Bin's own career, passages describing in the strategist's own apparent words rather than a later historian's second-hand account, the reasoning behind exactly the kind of indirect, psychologically calculated stratagems that had won the battles at Geiling and Malling. We have, for the first time in 2,000 years, Professor Han announced, at a gathering of scholars convened once enough of the material had been translated and verified to justify formal public announcement, direct physical and textual confirmation that Sun Bin was indeed a genuinely distinct historical figure from his more famous ancestor Sun Wu, possessed of his own separate and original body of strategic thought, much of which had been considered lost beyond any hope of recovery for the entire span of recorded Chinese history since some point in antiquity that we still cannot precisely date. This discovery does not diminish the achievement of the earlier, more famous treatise in any way. It restores to the historical record an entirely separate, and we are increasingly convinced as our translation work continues, genuinely significant body of strategic thought that the accidents of 2,000 years of history had very nearly succeeded in erasing entirely, preserved, in the end, not by any deliberate act of careful transmission across the centuries, as the more famous text had been, but by the sheerest possible accident. A tomb sealed in exactly the right waterlogged, airless conditions to preserve bamboo that should, by any ordinary reckoning, have rotted away to nothing within a few decades of its original burial, rediscovered only because a construction crew happened to break ground on this particular unremarkable hillside in this particular year, after 2,000 years during which the same ground had, for all we know, been disturbed by farmers and travelers 1,000 times without anyone ever suspecting what lay preserved just beneath the surface. What Lin Wei chose to remember. It was in the years following the formal publication of the excavation team's findings, years in which Lin Wei's own career came to be defined, in ways she could not have anticipated on that first cold morning driving out to an unremarkable hillside construction site, by her role in recovering and helping translate a text that scholars had argued over inconclusively for 2 millennia, that she found herself returning again and again. To a reflection she eventually set down in the introduction to her own later academic work on the subject, a reflection that struck a number of her colleagues, upon first reading it, as unusually personal for what was otherwise a rigorously technical piece of archaeological scholarship. I have thought a great deal, in the years since that first frantic week of excavation, she wrote, about the peculiar and in some ways rather moving parallel between the physical history of these bamboo strips and the human history of the man who is believed to have written them. Sun Bin's own body, according to the ancient tradition, was deliberately and permanently broken by a man who feared what his mind was capable of, crippled specifically, to prevent him from ever again commanding troops in the field, in the mistaken belief that a broken body would necessarily mean a broken, and therefore harmless mind. Sun Bin proved that assumption spectacularly and permanently wrong, achieving, from a covered chariot he could not walk away from unaided, 2 of the most celebrated strategic victories in the entire ancient military tradition. And yet his written legacy, the actual words in which he set down the strategic thought that had defeated his old friend not once, but twice, very nearly suffered exactly the fate his enemies had originally intended for the man himself. Erasure so complete that for 2,000 years, scholars could not even agree with confidence that it had ever separately existed at all. The achievement of his mind very nearly as thoroughly buried and forgotten as his crippled body eventually was, in some unmarked grave that history does not record, and that we have, despite years of searching, never been able to identify with any confidence. What I find myself returning to, again and again, is the sheer improbability of the specific chain of accidents that allowed even this partial recovery to occur at all. A tomb seal, for reasons we can only speculate about, in precisely the waterlogged conditions needed to preserve bamboo that should have rotted to nothing within decades. A construction crew breaking ground on this particular unremarkable hillside in this particular year, rather than any of the countless other years across 2 millennia during which the same ground might have been disturbed without anyone ever recognizing what lay beneath it. A research team assembled and available at precisely the right moment to recognize the significance of what had been found and race against the physical deterioration of the exposed material before it could be lost all over again, this time for good. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say that Sun Bin's own recorded life story, as Sima Qian preserved it for us, is itself a study in exactly this kind of patient, improbable persistence against forces determined to erase him. A man who survived mutilation, disgrace, and a sustained campaign to destroy him entirely, not through any dramatic act of defiance in the moment, but through years of quiet, careful, almost unbearably patient waiting for exactly the right opportunity to finally turn his enemy's own confidence against him. It seems to me a fitting, if entirely accidental, echo that his written legacy should have survived, against odds every bit as improbable, through precisely the same kind of patient waiting. 2,000 years spent in silent, airless darkness beneath an unremarkable hill, waiting, as it turns out, for exactly the right moment to finally be found. Epilogue: The Tree at Malling. There is a final detail, preserved only in the more literary retellings of the tradition rather than in Sima Qian's more sober historical account, that Lin Wei encountered years later, while researching the broader cultural afterlife of the Sun Bin story for a popular account of the discovery intended for general readers rather than specialist scholars. A detail she found herself including, ultimately, in her own final published work on the subject, despite its uncertain historical provenance. Because it seemed to her to capture something true about the story, even if its literal accuracy could never be verified. According to this later, more embellished retelling, travelers passing through the region of the ancient battlefield at Malling, for centuries afterward, told of a particular large tree, perhaps not the original tree itself, which could hardly have survived so many centuries, but a tree that local tradition had over generations come to identify with the one Sun Bin had ordered stripped of its bark on the night of Pang Huan's final defeat, whose wood local storytellers claimed retained a faint discoloration in the shape of characters no one could any longer quite read, a mark that farmers in the region were said to regard with a mixture of superstitious unease and genuine local pride, the story of Sun Bin's patient, 12-year vengeance having become, by that point, less a specific historical episode than a kind of regional parable, told to children, according to the tradition, as an illustration of the principle that patience, properly applied, could eventually defeat even an enemy who held every apparent advantage, provided the patient party was willing to wait long enough and think carefully enough and never once reveal, across however many years the waiting required, exactly how much of his original capacity for that thinking still genuinely remained. "I cannot vouch for the tree," Lin Wei wrote in the closing passage of her own final account of the discovery, and I suspect no historian honestly could, given how many centuries and how many generations of retelling separate any surviving version of that particular detail from the actual events at Maling in 341 BC. But I have come to think, in the years since I first knelt beside a tangled, waterlogged mass of 2,000-year-old bamboo strips on an unremarkable hillside outside Linyi, that the persistence of that story, true in its details or not, tells us something genuinely important about why Sun Bin's history mattered enough to the generations that followed him, that his memory survived in some form. Even through the 2,000 years, his own written words did not. He was crippled, disgraced, and very nearly erased entirely by a man who believed that breaking his body was sufficient to break the strategic mind housed within it. He proved that assumption wrong not through any single dramatic act, but through years of patient, careful, almost unbearably disciplined waiting, and when his moment finally came, he made certain, through a tree inscribed with his enemy's own death sentence, illuminated by a torch his enemy himself had ordered brought, that no one in that final moment or in any of the 2,000 years of retelling that followed would ever be able to mistake what had actually happened, or who had actually triumphed, or why. I think there is a reason that particular, almost theatrical final detail, the torch, the tree, the inscribed message waiting patiently in the darkness for exactly the right reader to arrive, has survived so vividly across 2,000 years of retelling, even as the man's own written treatise very nearly vanished entirely. It is, in the end, the story of a man who understood, perhaps better than any other strategist his era, produced that the truest and most lasting victories are not merely won. They are, if the victor is patient and careful enough, remembered in exactly the way he intends them to be, and Sun Bin, whatever else 2,000 years of silence eventually took from him, made entirely certain, in the one moment that mattered most, that this particular victory would never be forgotten. A note on what actually happened. The core historical framework of this account is drawn from the biography of Sun Bin preserved in Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, compiled in the 1st century BC, which describes Sun Bin as a descendant of the strategist Sun Wu, commonly known as Sun Tzu, betrayed and mutilated by his fellow student Pang Huan, who arranged to have Sun Bin's kneecaps removed through a false accusation of treason. According to this tradition, Sun Bin escaped to the state of Qi, where he served as a military strategist and orchestrated 2 celebrated victories over Wei forces commanded by Pang Huan. The Battle of Guiling in 353 BC, which established the strategic principle later known as besiege Wei to rescue Zhao, and the Battle of Maling in 341 BC, in which Sun Bin used a deliberately staged reduction in campfires to convince Pang Huan that the Qi army was disintegrating through desertion, luring him into a fatal ambush. For nearly 2,000 years, scholars debated whether Sun Bin had genuinely authored a separate military treatise distinct from his ancestors' famous work, as no verified copy survived. In 1972, construction work at Yingshan Silver Sparrow Mountain, near Linyi, Shandong Province, led to the discovery of Han Dynasty tombs containing thousands of bamboo strips preserved by unusual waterlogged burial conditions, including substantial portions of a previously lost text now identified by scholars as Sun Bin's own military treatise, confirming his status as a genuinely distinct historical author and recovering. For the first time in over 2,000 years, a significant body of his original strategic writing.